So everybody knows Nintendo is family friendly, right? I mean, look at their current console, the Wii. It's pretty much marketed as a family console, while their competitors, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, are seen as more hardcore, and therefore aimed at gamers aged 18 to 35. If you're above or below that demographic, chances are Nintendo's advertising is targeted at you. But people have taken this too far, to the point where there's a lot of numbskulls out there who think that the only games for Nintendo's consoles are kid-appropriate, and that it's always been that way and always will be that way. The fact is, this isn't true, and I fail to see how anyone could possibly believe it. It seems every time I do a game request video for the Nintendo 64 or Super NES, if the game contains any sort of adult content like blood or language, I'll get at least one harebrained comment from someone expressing such a surprise that a game like that wound up on a Nintendo console. After all, didn't Nintendo censor everything? The case they like to cite is Mortal Kombat, which was released simultaneously for several systems, including Nintendo's Super NES and Sega's Genesis. The Genesis version had blood, and the Super NES one did not, replacing all the blood splatters with a gray liquid, supposedly sweat, removing blood droplets and toning down the fatalities. While it was still obvious that people were being killed, they didn't show any blood. A lot of people seem to think that this no blood rule for Nintendo systems carried on and continues to this day, so let's just bust that myth up right now like a bitch. Come here, let me show you something.
So hey, here I am, your clearing confusion man, here to show you several games that I have for the Super NES, the Nintendo 64, the GameCube, and the Wii that are either rated M or close to it. So, for the Super NES, one thing that I want to show you is Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 was completely uncensored on the Nintendo 64, contained all the blood and all the fatalities. Now notice one thing you're not seeing is the ESRB rating. Mortal Kombat 2 was released before the ESRB was, even a thing, and that it was required for all games to submit if they were to be sold in certain stores and such. As a matter of fact, it was Mortal Kombat 2 that made the ESRB possible because it was released on a Nintendo console. Of course, it was, Mortal Kombat 1 was released on the Sega Genesis, and people claim it was uncensored, but what a lot of people forget to mention is that Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis was censored. You had to enter a code to see the violence. And while pretty much everybody knows the code, ABACABB, or ABACAB, which is, by the way, named after an album by the band Genesis. I got my CDs over there. I'd pull it out and show it to you, but it's all the way over there, and I'm trying to do a video here. I should have thought of that, though. But anyway, the fact is that the Sega Genesis had their own rating system in place, telling people what was and what wasn't appropriate for kids, and Nintendo didn't have that. So after Mortal Kombat 2, they pretty much had to. The next game I'm going to show you is Killer Instinct. Now, Killer Instinct is actually rated T for teen, but it does contain blood and fatalities, and it was made by Rareware, a second-party developer, meaning at that point that they were owned by Nintendo. And of course I have Mortal Kombat 3, which as you can see is rated M, and as you can see this is a Super NES cartridge. Those are all the Super NES cartridges I have, but just off the top of my head, of course there's Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which I unfortunately never got a copy of, and various other games that were rated M or did in fact contain blood. Moving on to the Nintendo 64, here's GoldenEye. Now this is a first-person shooter that is pretty violent, but it is rated T, which I always thought was funny. It seems that the ESRB has this whole thing where you can shoot people and you can show death and violence and everything, but as long as you don't show blood, you can still get a T rating. Although technically GoldenEye does have blood because it has that whole blood dripping down animation whenever you die, just like in the James Bond movies. But I guess if most of James Bond movies are rated PG or PG-13, I guess they felt that they could get away with a T in this one, which is kind of weird, but there you have it. Duke Nukem 64, which is rated M, and this is funny because this actually is censored compared to the game it's based on. It was based on Duke Nukem 3D, and they took out all the cursing. They took out all the nudity, and they took out some of the violence. Not all. There's still plenty of blood, enough to get it an M rating, but it's pretty toned down. The thing is, the censorship wasn't done by Nintendo. The censorship was done by GT Interactive Software, who published the game. So that is something that had nothing to do with Nintendo at all, and it still wound up being rated M anyway.
So yeah, those are just games I have. There's loads of other M or T-rated violent games out there that I don't have for all of those systems. So as I mentioned, the release of Mortal Kombat 2 uncensored on the Super NES sparked the creation of the ESRB, or Electronic Software Rating Board, which was founded in 1994. Keep in mind that while Nintendo no longer enforces their censorship on third-party games anymore, it wasn't because of the ESRB, as they stopped before it was created. Case in point, Mortal Kombat 2. Although the ESRB is an excellent reason for Nintendo to not bother with those sorts of things, the reason they stopped doing this was because it was costing them money. The Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat had outsold the Super NES version and put the Genesis on top for a while. Nintendo had to make something happen to regain their top spot, and so they did. But let's talk about the ESRB some more. The creation of the ESRB was actually a reaction to several politicians, such as Joe Lieberman, lobbying for government censorship of violent video games. So like the movie industry and music industry before it, the gaming industry came up with an independent, non-government ratings board, the ESRB, where developers can get their games rated on a voluntary basis. While participation in the ESRB is not required by law, major retailers such as Walmart and GameStop will not carry unrated games, and may also impose restrictions on selling severely rated games. So let's talk about how the ESRB works. First, there's the ratings. The original ratings were EC for early childhood, KA, or kids to adults, T for teen, M for mature, and AO for adults only. Basically, the EC rating is for educational games for very young kids. KA is like a G rating in movies, T is like a PG-13 rating, and M is like an R rating, and AO is like an NC-17 rating. Later on, in 1997, the ESRB retired the KA rating and replaced it with E for everyone. Though no one ever really said why this happened, my guess is they just felt it was easier to understand. In 2004, they added a rating E10+, sort of the equivalent of a PG rating for movies, for E-rated games that were a little bit more violent, but not enough to get a T. The ESRB system is not what you'd think. They don't play through the games and give ratings. Instead, developers send video footage for the most extreme content in their games and submit a questionnaire. They also pay a fee which can range from $800 to $4,000 depending on the development cost of the title. The game footage is reviewed independently by 3 separate people who are selected randomly from a pool of ESRB employees. No one knows who these reviewers are, as they're kept anonymous to avoid any sort of fraud or bribery on the part of the games industry. The 3 reach a consensus and send the rating to the developer, who can then appeal if they wish to. After the game is completed, they send the completed game along with the packaging to the ESRB, who review the packaging and randomly play the game to determine whether the rating or descriptors need to be changed, and the final rating certificate is given to the developer. So now that we understand the ESRB, let's get back to Nintendo. While it is true that there was a time that Nintendo games were censored, let's examine a few key points that people either seem to forget or just didn't know. 1. The censorship policies were an industry standard at the time, and competitors such as Sega had similar policies. 2. The reasoning behind Nintendo's censorship was not to punish developers or gamers, but rather to protect the industry. The censorship, along with Nintendo's policies involving their seal of quality and strict restrictions to do with licensing games on their systems, was a reaction to the video game crash of 1983, which I'll be talking about more in a future episode of Clearing Confusion. Not only did they want to control the flow of games coming out for their systems to avoid a deluge of shovelware titles that had been seen on the Atari 2600, they also wanted to avoid unlicensed titles being released on their system. Why? Well, take a look at all the porn games you'll find on Atari. That's why. 3. The censorship was done here by Nintendo's American branch. This is the reason that some games from Japan didn't come out here, and some games were changed from their original Japanese releases. More on that in a little bit. And 4. The policy was said to be strict, but was actually very flexible and inconsistent. Now, before I continue, I know what some of you want to say, but Necro, Nintendo still does censor games. Why, for example, the American release of Metroid Prime 3 Corruption on the Wii changed the word damn to no in the American release. Well, yeah, but this only applies to games released by Nintendo. They leave third-party developers alone now, and lets them do whatever they want. Keep in mind, though, it's not like Nintendo is set against this kind of content. Remember, the M-rated Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem was published by Nintendo. So anyway, let's talk about the nature of the censorship. While it's true that a lot of it had to do with violence, the fact is you can get away with a lot of violence, blood, and disturbing images even back in the old NES days. Take, for example, Ninja Gaiden, which has everything from people getting shot and cut apart to a blatant blowjob reference. Or Monster Party, which goes all Hellraiser right in the first level. Or Abadox, possibly the goriest game ever, as everything is made out of eyeballs and intestines and shit. Nintendo also censored nudity, but it was extremely inconsistent. One series that got repeatedly censored for nudity as well as violence is Castlevania. In Castlevania 3 on the NES, the topless Medusa was altered, but oddly, instead of just throwing a shirt or a toga on her, they just removed her breasts completely, which makes her look like a dude. Okay, that actually made it more disturbing. But when it got really weird was in Super Castlevania 4 on the Super NES. The tiny bit of blood on the title screen was removed, and the blood pools and drippings in one of the levels was changed to green acid, which is fine, but when it came to censoring nudity, what the fuck? You probably never even noticed the statues in the background of this stage. They're pretty subtle, but in the original Japanese version they were nude. It seems like if they bothered to tell Konami to throw a toga on nude statues that barely anyone would notice, that they're pretty much paying attention to things, right? But this occurs in the game after you fight the completely topless Medusa in level 2, which made it into the game completely uncensored. I mean, yeah, she doesn't appear to have nipples, which honestly just makes it weirder, but neither did the statues, so nude Medusa in the foreground is okay, but nude statues in the background isn't? No one can explain it. Another thing that gets censored is references to drugs or alcohol. As a matter of fact, this is one of those things that goes beyond Nintendo. One company that seemed to be excessively worried about references to alcohol was Squaresoft. Seems in Square games on the Super NES, nobody ever drank at bars, they all drank at cafes. It's easy to assume Nintendo was behind this, but remember, most of these games came out after the ESRB and after Nintendo stopped worrying about what third-party developers were doing. All of the censorship found in games like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger was done by Squaresoft themselves. This is why people in bars in Chrono Trigger are drinking soda. But most of all, the biggest thing that seemed to bother Nintendo of America, more than blood or violence, more than sex and nudity, and more than drugs and alcohol, was religion. Yeah. If you look at the list of censored Nintendo games, you'll find so many of them were censored for religious references. Even games with religious overtones, such as ActRaiser, where you played as a god, they weren't allowed to show certain images, such as a cross. Once again, Castlevania is notable as being the one series that seems to get a pass when it comes to this, as there's crosses and other Christian imagery in all the games, though sometimes it's a bit toned down, like this cross from Castlevania 3. Well, that's a pretty big cross, but take a look at the Japanese one. It looks like they said, well, if you have to have a huge cross right there at the beginning of the game, at least make sure it isn't glowing. There's other minor things, such as the holy water in the first game being called a firebomb in the manual. But no one that I knew called it that. We all called it holy water. But for every series or game that wasn't Castlevania, you couldn't even show a cross, mention a church, or anything. The church in The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past was changed to a sanctuary, and the evil priest, Aghanim, was changed to an evil wizard. Crosses were removed from clinics in Final Fantasy, And yeah, back to Zelda for a second, the Japanese title of Link to the Past is Triforce of the Gods. Can't have that. This is something Nintendo does even to this day. If you play The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time on the 3DS, you might notice the design of the mirror shield is changed to not have a seemingly Islamic symbol on it. And the music in the Fire Temple is changed to not have Islamic-sounding chanting in it. To end this off, I'm going to include the actual guidelines from Nintendo and some examples of games that clearly got past the censors. Games may not include sexually suggestive or explicit content including rape and or nudity, blowjob in Ninja Gaiden, sex in Go-Go 13. May not contain language or depiction which specifically denigrates members of either sex. Ninja Gaiden again. May not depict random, gratuitous, and or excessive violence. Well, just about every game that has you going around killing everything in sight, if that's not random or gratuitous violence, I don't know what is, but probably the biggest example is the Ultima games on NES, which allow you to attack any character, including NPCs. In Ultima Exodus in particular, you can enter into battle with such characters as Little Boy or Old Woman. May not depict domestic violence and or abuse. Okay, this one I can't think of any, and that's probably a good thing. May not depict excessive force in a sports game beyond what is inherent in actual contact sports. Base wars and arch rivals. May not reflect ethnic, religious, nationalistic, or sexual stereotypes of language. This includes symbols that are related to any type of racial, religious, nationalistic, or ethnic group, such as crosses, pentagrams, gods, Roman mythological gods are acceptable, Satan, hell, Buddha. Man, Zeus is allowed, but no Buddha? Well, I already pointed out Castlevania. May not use profanity or obscenity in any form or incorporate language or gestures that could be offensive by prevailing public standards and tastes. In other words, no fuck, shit, ream, or middle finger. I can't think of any examples where this got by off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure there are. May not incorporate or encourage the use of illegal drugs, smoking materials, and or alcohol. Probably the biggest example I can think of for this is Metal Gear. You start with cigarettes in your inventory. And finally, may not include subliminal political messages or overt political statements. Honestly, I don't think they were trying to do that back in the NES games, and most of these games came from Japan anyway, so I don't think they were real big on American politics. Well, anyway, that's everything I can tell you about Nintendo and censorship. Hopefully, if you were confused or misinformed before, well, now you're not. To put it in perspective, it's true that Nintendo once forced censorship on third-party games, but it is no longer true, and examples of censorship in the late 16-bit era or beyond in third-party games were done by the third parties and not by Nintendo. Well, that's it. See you next time, and we'll talk about that video game crash I mentioned.